Thank you, and I'd like to say what an honour and a pleasure it is to be here at the McGill School. I have to say that I don't think I know of anywhere else in Europe where such an ambitious programme of events bringing together the political leadership, commentators, people from the region in open debate over a whole week. I can't think of anywhere else where that exists, and it's a wonderful experience to be part of it. I want to thank Marion and Lucinda for their great speeches, and just to say that if we have a referendum in the UK, I want you there with us on our side. I'm going to make a few remarks about the dream, talk a little bit about the European elections, and then mention the country I come from, which I think most of you may now have guessed is the United Kingdom. The dream. You know, sometimes when we talk about the European dream, it's as if we have a vision of people coming together in the 1940s and 50s, like a group of church elders negotiating amongst themselves the true path. I don't think it was like that at all. I think it was a sensible, strategic vision of the long-term self-interest of the participants. It wasn't pure altruism. It wasn't naivety of thought. It was, how can we avoid what has happened in the past, and how can we prepare the future? For France, it was a way of remaining an influence in the world. A defeated, economically ruined France would have had no influence. Europe was the way to retain influence. For Germany, it was a way to rebuild, and it was a way to come back into the world community of nations. For Benelux, you know, if you're a small country the size of Luxembourg, which has the population then of about the same as Cork has, and you suddenly have the greatest army that had ever been assembled in the history of the world since the reign of King Darius in 5th century BC Persia. And this army comes through your country and destroys it in a day, then actually you think to yourselves, and this was the second time in 30 years, you think to yourselves, actually there must be a better way than this. We must find some means of preventing this from happening. So there was self-interest then, and if the European Union is to thrive, and if we're to regain momentum in the European Union, we need to recover not some idealism, we need to recover some sense of what is in our strategic interest, our strategic self-interest. Mr. Cameron, whose name has already figured once or twice this morning in our discussions, Mr. Cameron 2 days ago said, we must now stand up to Russia and what it is doing in the Ukraine. He didn't say this to the Commonwealth leaders. He didn't say it as something that he could do on his own. He wasn't addressing China and India, or even the United States. He was addressing his European partners. Because if sensible strategic pressure is to be placed on Russia, it has to come from Europe. It's complicated because some European countries are very heavily energy dependent on Russia. Some are very dependent on the volume of trade, much more so than the United Kingdom. So it's a difficult argument. It's an argument that has to be won through engagement. But it is an argument that can only be won in Europe. We're all of us aghast at what is happening in Gaza. There's nothing Ireland can do about it. There's nothing Britain can do about it. But if we manage to find sustained pressure from the European Union, that can have a serious effect in terms of bringing sensible pressure on the partners, and particularly on Israel, to come to some kind of negotiated settlement. We are facing, in the next 10 years, the full impact of the digital revolution. That revolution almost certainly threatens 20 to 25% of jobs in Europe. How do we master that digital revolution? How do we ensure that its undoubtedly positive potential is also beneficial to the European economy and not simply to a significant number of American companies which are in the forefront of that revolution at the moment? It's in part a question of infrastructure, it's in part of a question of the regulatory framework. That's European. That's not something that can be done nationally. We're about to embark on the biggest trade deal negotiations, they've already started, with the United States. Ireland can't negotiate such a deal with the United States. Britain can't negotiate such a deal with the United States. If there is to be a deal, and we've got to be very careful about the terms of it and the conditions, and not let it undermine our European way of life, but if there's to be a deal, it's a European-American deal, or there's no deal at all. And so, at every stage, it's not a question of appealing to the better nature of countries and participants. It's a question of saying to those countries, this is your interest, this is your long-term future, contribute, engage in that project, and that will give the European Union the momentum that it requires. We've just had European elections. A few remarks about the results, because Marion gave a great deal of information on that, which is very pertinent. And I think the balance of her remarks was right. This was an election which reflects public disenchantment with politicians in general. And somehow a European election makes it easier to express that disenchantment than a purely national election where people see more easily what's at stake. The overall outcome was a strengthening of populist, Eurosceptical, anti-European, Europhobic, and in some cases, extreme right forces. Those forces, even when all grouped together, still represent a clear minority in the Parliament. And in many ways, most positively, they don't work together. Indeed, they're at each other's throats most of the time, and don't it doesn't in itself constitute a block on Europe continuing the path of building a European entity which can benefit the member states that it represents. But you have to take that into account. You can't say this hasn't happened or it's an aberration. What's interesting if you analyze it is that there isn't a neat correlation between economic misery and the success of the populists. Otherwise, Spain wouldn't have sent any Democrats at all to Brussels. But in Spain, the elected representatives from Spain come from pro-European parties. Different visions of Europe, but all of them in the European mainstream. Whereas in Britain and in France, which also have suffered during the economic crisis, you can't say, well, it's because of the economic crisis that you now have, from a country which considers itself to be a brand leader in parliamentary democracy, you have what I call pinstriped saloon bar xenophobes, which is UKIP. And in France, which is supposed to be the cradle of civil rights and human liberties, you end up with Marine Le Pen as the first party. You need to look deeper at that, and I'm not saying Europe's got nothing to do with it, but what I am saying is that you have to look at as well at the standing of politicians and at the way that our political parties and our standard political parties have ceased to reach out to people. Everywhere in Europe, it's not only that participation in election falls, although in this European election for the first time we managed to avoid a fall in turnout, it is that activists, supporters, participants in the political process at local, regional or national or European level, all of that participation is on a downward trend. and it's because people are doing other things with their lives, that they follow politics in a different way from the way that people of my generation follow politics, and it is because, quite frankly, if you like, the shortcomings and weaknesses and human turpitudes of politicians have been exposed in a way 24/7, never before. And so that the myth of the politician, you'll excuse me, as being a godlike or a goddess-like figure, that myth has long since been dispelled. And so people do other things and don't follow politicians and expect some sort of role in the process if they're to participate in the process at all. And that's a phenomenon which is Europe-wide, but it's not specifically European Union, even if it's felt at European Parliament elections. Let me make one reference to why these European Parliament elections were a little bit different. Quite a few of us who've seen these elections and seen every time that the participation in those elections was declining believe that you had to do something to change the nature of it. You could say, yes, but the European Parliament has a very big role in co-decision, or that the European Parliament shares the responsibility over the budget, or that it holds the executive to account, and you've already lost people's attention. But if you say, actually, this is also a presidential election, then people start to pay a little bit more interest. And so those of us who took this view, and it's been a very long process, we tried to turn this election into a presidential one for the first time ever. The treaty, the most recent treaty, Lisbon, says you have to take account of the election results when the Council proposes to the Parliament the name of the Chief Executive of Europe or the President of the Commission. And that President of the Commission has to be elected by a majority of MEPs. And what we did was, on that basis, we encouraged the political parties to choose their candidate for president in advance, so that people would know that if they voted for Fine Gael, that they would be voting for Jean-Claude Juncker as president of the Commission, and if they voted Labour, they'd be voting for Martin Schulz as president of the Commission. This was a dummy run. We never knew whether this would succeed at all, and a lot of people in Brussels and elsewhere, and particularly in national capitals, said, you must be mad. You are not going to impose on us, the heads of government, who've always had this responsibility in the past, a name simply because of the election results. We've got the right to choose, and we'll choose who we like, irrespective of what the elections tell us. But the parliamentarians, both before and after the elections, say, I'm sorry, if you come to us with a name of someone who hasn't been proposed in those elections as the candidate, we will reject that name. And so you had this rather odd situation of a presidential election, which some people didn't think of as a presidential election, and where we didn't really have the resources or the means to conduct it. Nonetheless, we fought it. The main candidates crisscrossed Europe, held rallies in most large cities, were present in the media, TV debates, a big social media presence, which played a very big role, and contributed to a layer in this campaign of a presidential contest. There are a lot of flaws in it. A lot of people didn't understand or got very disappointed when they realized that the only way to support Jean-Claude Juncker was to vote for Party X, or the only way to vote for Martin Schulz was party-wide. Let me give just the Spanish example. In Spain, and I'm talking to you from my own experience in the Schulz campaign, in Spain, Martin Schulz, because of his activities, has a very high name recognition. 40% of Spaniards know who he is, because he's spent a lot of time there and working on issues which concern them. When he had rallies there were huge sellout rallies, thousands and thousands of people turning up to hear him at rallies in Barcelona, in Malaga, in Madrid, in Valencia and elsewhere. But then when people realized that to support Martin Schulz for the presidency of the Commission, you had to vote for PSOE, the local socialist party, which is, quite frankly, pretty discredited and which is blamed for the crisis, they said, I'm sorry, I'd like to see him as president of the Commission, but you can't ask me to vote for PSOE. And that's a genuine problem that we face. It's a huge task of selling a candidate for the presidency in any circumstances, to sell it in Europe with all the linguistic, cultural differences. I'm just amazed that we got as far as we did. I was amazed that in the French party political broadcasts, the party political broadcasts would actually say, we need change in Brussels, we the French socialists are backing Martin Schulz as the next president of the Commission, and here he is speaking in French, few sentences in a party political broadcast. That to me is the beginning of the creation of a European debate, a European demos, and ultimately a real presidential election, which I think can motivate people because it personalizes, because it gives people some sense of empowerment. British people were able to dismiss Churchill in 1945, after the end of the war. They could dismiss Churchill, they couldn't dismiss Barroso. And it's that feeling of being out of control and not having any say in who is running Europe that, to a certain extent, contributes to the disenchantment. Having talked about Britain, I'll just make a few comments, because Britain decided to sit this election out in terms of the presidential aspect. The main government party is not a member of the main conservative parliamentary grouping in the European Parliament. The Labour Party is a bit semi-detached. The Liberals are a full member of the Liberal International, but didn't back the Liberal candidate for the presidency of the Commission, Guy Verhofstadt. UKIP, of course, were doing their own thing. And so you ended up with a European Parliament election in Britain, which wasn't about European issues or European choices. It was about whether you're in or you're out. It was about UKIP or not UKIP. And that was, I think, a big mistake made by the mainstream political parties, and they paid the price for that. They didn't put forward their vision of Europe. They just put themselves forward as an anti-UKIP party. And the trouble is that in the TV debates or discussions, UKIP has a better performer than any of the three-party leaders who, when they start to talk about Europe, lose any sense of passion or commitment or concern and just sound like tedious third-rate bureaucrats, quite frankly. And it's no contest, because Farage has the emotional argument. You talk about treaties and subsidiarity and the rest, and he has a very simple message. I want my country back. I want us to decide our own future. And against that, you've not got much in the way of argument without it becoming very complicated. And one of the great failures of pro-Europeans in Britain is to follow 30 or 40 years of quietism, of saying nothing, we're in, so we'll stay in, and we don't need to defend it, now followed by a failure to indicate and identify arguments that people can relate to. So I am concerned about any referendum that might take place in Britain, because I believe that Britain is a European country just as much as any other country. I'm concerned about it because I think that there is a serious danger that we can lose it and that Britain will leave the European Union. I'm concerned about it as well because we seem to have become, and my own party shares some of the responsibility for this, involved in an agenda about reform. And reform is another of those weasel words, a bit like dream. I mean, nobody's against reform, but what reform exactly? And when you listen to what passes for ideas on the reform process, you get some very, very complicated and confusing answers from those who are in favour of a referendum. They want reform in terms of giving back to national parliaments more powers to block European legislation. At the same time, they say we need to complete the single market. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that actually if you try to have a digital single market, but you allow national parliaments to issue red cards, that they will do that in order to defend their national champions in any liberalisation of the market. So those two reform ideas are mutually contradictory. And what concerns me as well is that some people, when they talk about reform, they say Brussels should do less, and there's a strong case for making that argument, and that we should just concentrate on the internal market and on competitiveness. When in fact what they mean is, and this is certainly the agenda of the British Conservatives, you pursue with the economic legislation, but you try to shed all that is connected with the protection of health and safety of working people, of environmental legislation, of ecological standards, of social rights. And quite frankly, if they're successful in that, and they do have some support from other countries, every step forward that they take in gutting the whole idea of a social Europe or of an environmental Europe will win them a few more friends from the private sector, but will lose them support from the progressive part of the population and from trade unionists and from others. They have to build, to win a referendum, a successful coalition across the board, and that in my view means being very careful about what you seek to change. Nor do I believe that you can win a referendum in the UK on the basis of threats. You can't just say, get a whole selection of chief executive officers of companies coming forward and saying, well, X thousand jobs, X hundred jobs will be at stake. You've got to put something positive onto the table. And I think that the kind of positive things that need to be put on the table, but not as ideas, but as realizations, have to a certain extent been put forward by the incoming Commission in the form of its programme. Because I think if you say to people, we need an energy union, which guarantees supply at reasonable prices to all the countries in Europe, if you bring to the table, we need a big public infrastructure programme concerning the digital revolution, concerning the greening of our economies, concerning transport, then I think those are the sort of ideas which can actually get through to people. And I think if we simply do it on the basis of bludgeoning people and saying, you better vote to stay in, otherwise you'll be in deep trouble, I don't think that works. I think that we can win a referendum in the UK. I think we have to be extremely intelligent how we fight it. I think we have to Europeanize it. I think we have to bring, and my friends, pro-Europeans in Britain, think this is a crazy idea, but I think we have to bring non-Brits into that debate and into that discussion. I think hearing voices from other member states, de-demonizing many of them, including those from new member states who have come and worked and are doing a fantastic job in the United Kingdom and for the UK economy. I think if you bring those new voices to play in the debate, that can have a very positive effect. There are, as one of the speakers has already mentioned, that there has been a big danger that you substitute the debate for Europe about immigration and free movement. In reality, the situation on free movement is a very advantageous one for the UK, that a lot of people contributing to the UK economy, paying their taxes, bringing a dynamism into the workforce, are coming from new member states. And Britain is putting a lot of those people who will be drained on public services and the health services into retirement communities in Spain and in southern France. So This seems to me, on the whole, to be a pretty good deal for the United Kingdom, and it's certainly what people appreciate and enjoy. And I think we've just got to bring those facts to the table. I want to conclude in saying that it seems to me that a sea change has happened in Brussels, that we are beginning to create a genuine parliamentary democracy in Brussels, which is different, which is new, which, as Marianne says, works in a different way from national politics. But it will now be the European Parliament which, in partnership with the Commission, can take forward an agenda for the European Union. And I also think that we can win the battle for public opinion, but we have to be intelligent and sophisticated about winning that battle, and we have to work at it not simply when there's a referendum announced for a month's time or 2 months' time. We have to start on that work now. Thank you very much.